Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our King's Hammer speaker series. We're really excited to return and really thrilled to be bringing in Dr. Laura Finnegan this afternoon. I want to thank all of you coaches who are joining us today. We encourage each of you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can feel free to drop them in the chat section of whatever platform you're on. So whether you're viewing this today through Facebook or you're on our YouTube channel, you can feel free to add in any questions you might have. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. If there are questions that we are unable to get to within the course of the session, we're going to send them over to Dr. Finnegan, and she'll be happy to get answers for us. And those will be posted later on the website as part of the presentation. And now I'm excited to present Dr. Laura Finnegan. Dr. Finnegan founded the Football Research Group in 2020, which brings together a variety of international academics and practitioners engaged in football research. She's recently completed a PhD in talent development in youth football. She is currently working on several football research projects, including a UEFA-funded investigation with club environments across 7 European countries. She's also presented on several coaching courses, including the UEFA Pro license, as well as the US Soccer Talent Scout license. Hi, Laura. How are you? Good afternoon, or I guess where you're at, it's good evening there in Ireland. Hope you've had a great day. So before we get started, I was just wondering, we celebrated National Women in Sports Day earlier this month. For us, we're kind of extending that with this Female Perspectives in Youth Soccer presentation today for our coaches who are joining us, and next Wednesday for our families of our female athletes. Why is this an important topic for you?
For me personally, I suppose I approach it from a couple of different viewpoints. I'm a former soccer player myself, so I suppose that's always been my passion in life. So to be able to merge that through my work on the academic side of things is just a perfect fit for me. As a researcher, female sport has been neglected for so long, and so often I suppose females have been just seen as mini men, with the idea that any findings in the male game are just automatically replicated towards females as well. So I think we've a duty of care to our girls and our women to really investigate them within the sports field. And as a mother as well, I'm passionate about my 2 girls having the same opportunities as my son will have.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. So as I mentioned previously, you've done presentations, including presentations similar to this, both in the US and obviously internationally. As we jump into this with our coaches, do you have any specific objectives or maybe outcomes that you would hope that they take away with them at the conclusion of the presentation?
Yeah, to me, the focus of the hour will be to provide insights on how best to support the development of our young female footballers or soccer players. I will mix those up throughout the hour, I'm sure. But what are the key things that you need to know to best support them, to help them to be healthy and to reach their potential as well within the game?
That's awesome. All right. Well, I am sure that our coaches who are joining us are excited, or our football coaches, whether it's football, soccer, are excited to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you. You've got the floor, and I'll see you at the end.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen there. Yes, as I mentioned to Will there, really that the plan is to take a whistle-stop tour throughout the timeline of female development, growth and maturation, with a focus on puberty. And then to talk through some coaching considerations and key messages to support young women as they progress through King's Hammer, perhaps into college soccer and into adulthood as well. Happy to finish with a question and answer slot. As Will mentioned, we might not get to them all, but I'm happy to provide written answers to all of them, and even include links about where you can go and learn a little bit more, because as I said, it will be quite a whistle-stop tour across a number of different factors. So the main area of research that I engage in youth football is looking at the environment that we create for youth soccer players. This might feel like a bit of a strange place to start, but this quote has always resonated with me on that topic. So great things are done not by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. And if we look at a snapshot of some of the small things that Van Gogh has created, on their own they don't look too impressive, but if we look at them as a whole, then they do start to resemble great things. And for me, that's indicative of this holistic ecological approach to talent ID and player development, the role of the environment. So let's look at what are some of the small things in your environment. And for me, a key part of that is our approach to such things as growth, maturation, and development. This can impact on how positive the players' experiences are, how appropriate their experiences are for the current stage of their unique development journey, and how well we lay the foundations for an athlete's intrinsic motivation to sustain engagement in soccer over a prolonged period of time. So those three things are slightly different. Growth is about an increase in the size of the body or a specific part of the body. Maturation relates to the process, I suppose, of becoming mature, and that's tempo and timing, and covers a variety of areas such as sexual maturation and skeletal maturation. Development is a broader concept, and that covers biological, cognitive, emotional, moral, and behavioral aspects. And that's change that occurs as a consequence of both maturation and development. So it's really important to understand child's growth and development from our perspective as coaches and those engaged with youth sport, because children will develop at different rates, which will impact on their sporting ability, as well as impact on their ability to understand coach instructions or be able to carry out some physical tasks, or even to interact positively with teammates. So development occurs over different areas. So, we have our physical and our motor skills. We have our cognitive development, so that thinking, learning, solving problems. Psychosocial is how we interact with others. But a key developmental process across a lifespan is puberty. Obviously, due to the nature of today's presentation, we are going to focus on female puberty. And puberty reflects a set of biological processes through which sexual maturation and the potential for human reproduction is achieved. So sometimes it's easier if we think about it like that. It's a process that brings us to where we need to go in life, and it can take up to about 4 years. A lot of things happen. Like, the only other time in your life that you're growing at a quicker rate of this is in the first year of your life. So a lot of things happen. It isn't necessarily seen as like a sudden single event. We know when a young girl is going through it, but it's often difficult to pinpoint an exact beginning and an ending. And it's stimulated by hypothalamus in the brain and release of key hormones and all of that. But the end product is that increase in the circulation of types of estrogen. And as those estrogen levels rise, well, then this cascade of puberty begins. The first signs of that, so again, if you are dealing with the under 10 group, it's very likely that you have some girls that are starting this process already. Around that, anywhere between kind of 8 and 12 years of age, is that the first sign of puberty, which is breast budding. And really that's a precursor to menarche, which is that first menstrual period. It actually is quite a late event in puberty, and it happens after our maximum growth. Other things that are happening there, so as I said, the breast budding comes first, then we tend to have this rapid growth period, and then we will have this big event of the first menstrual period or cycle. The average is about 12 and a half for that, the average age. What's really fascinating, in the 1800s, the average age was actually 17, but that's come right down now to 12 and a half. Why? It's theorized that it's due to our improved nutrition and lifestyle and health factors. So that's what it is, about 12 and a half, but can happen anywhere between 11 and 14. So what we need to consider here is that the key part of puberty is to develop these robust systems and sustain them into adulthood. The menstrual cycle is a really good barometer of health, so it's important that it's functioning correctly, and you as a coach can have an impact on that, which we'll focus on. Other things that are happening around that time as well, although controlled by different parts of the brain, are things like sweating, acne, and pubic hair development. I'll preface this graph by saying that puberty affects every child at different rates. So timelines and expectations of coaches should focus on the physiological stage of the child, and maybe have some idea of where that might be, right? My 7-year-old is in that at the minute, showing no signs of this. And 2, 3, 4, and 5, which kind of progress up to the end of, or the mature state, post-pubertal. There's a lot of variation in individuals in timing, and that's when this adolescent spurt occurs, and tempo as well, that the rate of progress through the spurt. So you can see a lot of things going on there in that graph. I mentioned that menarche, the first menstrual period, is kind of late, like it comes after this big growth period. And that growth period is really extensive. So it's about, I have 3 inches there, but I'll convert that. So that's about 8 centimeters per year until about 15. To put that into perspective, after 16, they're only likely to grow another 7 centimeters, give or take. So this is where all that growth is happening. So it's really important that we manage that process carefully with our female athletes. This increased growth rate reaches its maximum or its fastest growth around 12, and it can slow down after that. What's interesting about females and how we differ from males as well is that we'll grow taller, but our bones strengthen later. Muscles and tendons don't lengthen at the same time. Our girls get taller, but bones don't necessarily get stronger at the same time. So when girls are in this period of rapid growth, then we need to just consider their training. So have a look at maybe impact. So maybe reduce the amount of impact or loading that they're doing, and maybe change it instead for things like coordination and motor control, which we'll look at later. You could monitor peak height velocity with regular height measuring to plot that rate of growth. And as I said, we don't need to stop them training when they're in that really rapid period of growth. We don't need to stop them training, but consider reducing the load and focus more on coordination and body control. What else is happening around there now? So that's growth rate I'm showing there. About several months after that real peak or maximum growth in height, adolescent females will tend to gain a lot more weight. That ranges from about 5 to 10 kg every year. They'll continue to gain fat mass, and we proportionally see that concentrated in the lower body, because remember that the widening of the hips are happening here as well. So with all that, with this rapid growth period, widening of the hips, during this period, you probably have seen it yourself, the changes in movement capability and movement patterns. Now, adolescent awkwardness has been researched a little bit more in males than females, and it relates to a period of incoordination, lasts about 6 months. Why? Well, it's that temporary disruption in motor control. It's almost about relearning how to move, relearning our movement patterns in the sport. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about, being patient with whether they're males or females going through this growth rate. It's a really tricky time, I suppose. There's a lot of things going on. What I think is really interesting about this graph as well is if we reflect on dropout rates, which do tend to be higher with girls than boys. So almost 70% of girls will have dropped out of sport by the time they're finished all of this that you can see on your screen happening. Why a couple of research projects have looked into that, said, look, they found it to be a time of great change and upheaval. They felt support or lack of advice as well, not knowing where to go maybe for help. Failing, girls that fail during puberty, because this is all wrapped up with body image and confidence and competence, that experiencing failure are more likely to get them to drop out. And even feeling physically and emotionally vulnerable as well. Almost half of 14 to 16-year-olds said that their period stops them taking part in sport and physical activity as well, with a lack of female role models. So that's something that we need to consider, even about the club as well, within all our clubs. So there's some things to consider. What I thought might be interesting to show you is that for those of you who coach both males and females, it's interesting to note that these processes are happening differently between the sexes. And this is why I said at the start to Will that it's really important that we don't just see women or girls in sport as being mini men and kind of, reduce the research down for that. These processes happen differently. So for example, there that the peak height velocity occurs earlier in females than males, 2 years earlier for girls than boys. It's probably why we can sustain mixed sex play into adolescence in soccer. But females lack the testosterone of males to gain that muscle strength. So gender strength differences tend to become apparent, particularly when boys are hitting that peak height velocity at maybe between 13 and 15, at that average age of 14 there. What's interesting about both is that in males, that peak growth spurt of height, weight and muscle actually occur all at the same time. So that little graph that you can see with boys, there's a lot of things going on there, that height, weight and muscle. But actually in females, those growths occur in sequence in that order. So girls will get taller and then they will put on a bit more fat mass and then that fat-free mass or muscle. So again, quite different. Some of you will have entered puberty late, others on time and others early. It's about 70 to 80% determined by genetics. The other 20% is to do with your lifestyle factors and nutrition. But this is a wonderful image just to show that chaotic nature of the timing and tempo of kids as they enter this growth velocity. So what you can see there on that screen is the red lines are the rates of growth for kids that were classed as early maturers. So those boys that were ahead of the on time, which is, for boys is around that maybe 14. So you can see them hitting that real rapid phase of growth, starting that at about 10 or 11. What I love about this graph as well is that you can see that there are different tempos and timings. So you can see some of the growth curves are really short. So really like rapid periods of growth, whereas others are more leisurely and just tend to happen over a longer period of time. I thought this graph was fantastic. Whether a child is an early, on time or a late mature can impact on opportunities within the sporting environment. So we know that, for example, in male UK academy teams, they're stacked with early maturers. Why? Well, they can physically impact the game more effectively. That makes them stand out more. While our late maturers, so, we're talking about kids that don't go through this growth spurt until maybe 15 or 16, are already gone from development pathways. Again, we don't have enough information on these patterns with female athletes yet, but we're trying to get there. Because it isn't as clear cut with girls. Early maturing girls often experience more problems in school, seek earlier independence from parents. I've actually been found to engage in like risky behaviours and gain more popularities with boys as well. This pattern of is kind of ebbs and flows due to the nature of female growth. So, for example, in 6th grade, early maturing girls display greater satisfaction with their bodies when asked in questionnaires. But actually by 10th grade, that had swapped around. So in late adolescence, the late maturing girls still have that thinner body shape, the type that tends to be idealized as this traditionally feminine beauty and what girls should look like. Early maturing females, again, the girls that have gone through this growth spurt at an earlier age, can actually suffer from an increased risk of social and emotional problems. Again, why? Well, perhaps they're putting on this fat mass and hips widening at an earlier age. Maybe they're seen as not as athletic looking as they were, or in comparison with some of their peers. So it's really interesting from a male perspective. Being an early mature is all good in these early stages, but the research varies when it comes to girls. During puberty, of course, changes are broader than just physical. And really, as coaches and particularly as parents, which I'll touch on next week, adolescents should be assured that these changes are all temporary and they're normal. Coaches can support these changes and encourage the development of sport-specific skills. Again, I spoke about that adolescent awkwardness, maybe almost kind of relearning skills. So patience about that, allowing them to kind of grow into their new bodies. But maturation also influences behavioral development. For example, like increased self-consciousness, concern with weight gain, relationships with the opposite sex, all of that. It's a time when girls become more independent and form new relationships with peers, when appearance, social activities, and such a sport, such as soccer, can be a way of expressing that solidarity with friends. And this can be a tricky one for yourselves as coaches to navigate, because the process of comparison is getting stronger. So suddenly now I'm able to look at other athletes and say, okay, how now do I measure up against them in terms of my ability? There can be an upsurge in competition and animosity between girls as some struggle with their self-esteem, so can turn that into kind of quite nasty outputs. Perceptions of competence, so how good I think I am, are lowered around that time. And the value and opinions of peers is really high. So navigating all of that as a coach can be really tricky. Particularly, you become a significant role model for a mid-adolescent there, because they tend to start to identify with non-parental adults, and often you can be a key one for that. We've probably all seen it with that early adolescence, the time when emotional highs and the lows increase. Again, there's a good bit of research on this to show that the highs are very high and the lows are very low. And particularly to us adults, that intensity of emotion can seem really out of proportion from the events that elicit them. But again, this is all normal and atypical as they progress through this stage. On that kind of confidence and self-perception, there was a large UK study done on puberty in girls in sport. And an interesting outcome was that girls felt ready for the physical symptoms. So periods, cramps, breast development, weight gain, hips widening, sweating, body odor, underarm hair, spots, leg hair, pubic hair. I mean, it's a wonder we get them out the door at all. But they felt completely unprepared for the emotional impacts, like mood swings, anger, upset, low confidence, feelings of being watched, feeling dirty during menstruation, just an increase of kind of awkwardness and that middle bit between progressing from being a child to being an adult, especially when we look at all of this happening at a time of school change and upheaval as well. All of that kind of lack of support or expectation for that can lead to negative attitudes towards sport. So particularly here, when we are talking about keeping girls engaged in sport, making sure that they are healthy by the end of this whole process, and trying to develop this lifelong engagement with the sport and kind of reach their maximum potential. Negative attitudes towards sport during puberty and that transition from being a child to an adult. So they felt that younger siblings tended to take precedent. Schoolwork took over a little bit for them. They felt this desire for new experiences, so a little bit bored, or things were starting to look as, oh, that's a little bit childish now. Maybe I need to do something else. I mentioned that animosity between girls, and that kind of really left a negative attitude towards sport. The importance of looking good, but then again, if you're overly sporty, that can lead to negative stereotyping as well. Embarrassed about physical changes, so sharing communal changing rooms and needing to wear a bra for the first time. That they also recognize that shift in sport actually as well, and from maybe the fun and social activity that they enjoyed into more of a competitive sphere. All this while trying to gain or retain peer acceptance. So, for example, new friendship groups in school might think, gosh, is she playing soccer? What? So all of that is going on in this time of puberty. I mentioned the menstrual cycle as well. I mentioned the average age of that starting is about 12 and a half. I think a key thing we can take away from today is to remove the awkwardness surrounding it. Try to reduce the perceptions of it as being a taboo subject. And gosh, I'd rather talk about anything else in the whole world than that. If we take a physiological approach to it, it is simply a cyclical fluctuation of hormones. That's all it is. And it's a key barometer of health. The main event of the menstrual cycle being that ovulation bit, as you can see there, around that day 14 there. Ovulation produces female sex hormones of estrogen and progesterone, but both are needed for optimal female health. So to sustain healthy female functioning, but also to enable them to sustain higher levels or increased levels of training, competition, and ultimately performance. The research on the menstrual cycle and performance and injury is in its relative infancy. There isn't a lot of great work out there on it, but what we can say is that it is an inflammatory process, and we do know that excess inflammation can lead to injury. That's why there now is a couple of research projects that have shown that ACL injuries can occur more commonly prior to ovulation, so when these estrogen concentrations are the highest. So that might be something to think about. And again, there's more work coming on that. But really, given the individuality of symptoms and really lack of coherence in research, it's really too early to provide any real guidelines in that. But what I would say is that definitely players, so encourage your players to do it. And I'll show you in the next slide how they might do that. And even the coaching group to track menstrual cycles, symptoms, just to improve awareness of any phase-related effects on individual performance. And again, if that's something that you talk about at maybe an initial meeting at the start of the year, again, get rid of that taboo. Because almost over 40% of 14 to 6-year-olds say that their period stops them taking part in physical activity in clubs. So I think if we can just strip away as much as we can that taboo, that will lessen those negative associations with it as well. This is an app that I would recommend players download. It's called Fitter Women, FITR, and it can be found in Google stores and iStores as well. And again, that will just allow athletes to log their own data, monitor it. It will talk about, what is the physiology happening in your body right now. These are some of the potential side effects or kind of impacts that are affecting you right now. So that's really, it's something that Chelsea women and even Dawn Scott with US Soccer was really keen to try and harness for other players. So differences in maturation, so maybe that early or late maturation, can really lead to selection advantages and play-in opportunities for older players. And really it's the Matthew effect of the rich getting richer. It can ultimately result in differences in the average attainment of otherwise similar levels of athletes. So there's two terms that are commonly used, that the shouting talent, so the ones that will dominate, the ones that will stand out to us, and perhaps there are early maturers in the squad, physically stand out. That can bring its level of confidence, but again, we need to do more work here on the female side, because a lot of this is from males. What are some of the problems with that, and how might we need to support her more effectively? What we have found is that sometimes these athletes can rely on their physicality, and that can actually impede technical and tactical development. They might actually suffer more burnout and overuse injury, because it's probably that athlete that is being brought and selected to more teams and squads. If we chat about, and again, this is quite a general way to approach that, but if we look at maybe our whispering talent, who remember the graph of all the different timings and tempos of maturation, hits that a little bit later, can be physically out-muscled. And again, that can bring its feelings of inadequacy. And I've mentioned how puberty can negatively affect perceptions of self-confidence and competence. So all of that can affect that. Might drop out. What there is a bit of exploration on at the minute is that if we can keep these late maturing athletes in the system, perhaps maturation can bring more developed technical, tactical and psychological development. That underdog hypothesis of always having to struggle, and you're learning about resilience and kind of getting up and going again. But again, the key point here is that a lot of this has been on the male development pathway. So we are trying to do a little bit more work from the female side, but it is, key point is to look at, well, how do we support these types of females more effectively? Just touch a little bit on the relative age effect. So what is it? It's a preference for selecting athletes born earlier in the age band. It's due to physical maturation factors. So remember our shouting talent there, but also a lot of other things are going on there. So we know that the relative age effect is present in sports that have no physical component, things like chess. We know that the relative age effect is prevalent in education as well. So kids born closer to the cutoff do better. So what is it? Well, along with, the physical side is there, but we have to explore the cognitive and social and emotional development that being potentially almost a year older than your teammates can give you. So the relative age effect is something to consider as coaches within this kind of teen age group. Study done on Norwegian girls football and found that the level of the relative age effect became greater as females progressed through the stages. This is something that as a club you could do as well, and I would always just suggest that you do it to kind of draw out this pathway. So this had a look at, well, what were the expected ages? So what's happening in Norway at the time? And then this was different levels, all from local clubs and then along different selection pathways into the regional team. So a quarter of the regional team were born before March. Is prevalent in US girls soccer as well. This was a study done a few years ago on the ECNL. There was over 7,000 girls in this. So we looked initially at what was the expected. So this is the American spread of quarters of birth. Pretty average, and you'll find that across most countries. We've done a lot of this work. But what they actually observed was quite different than that. So there were more girls born earlier in the selection year, so these quarter ones. So now we have our girls that are older than their peers and are standing out for some reasons, be it physically, cognitively, socially. There's studies that captains and leaders are more likely to be born in quarter one as well, advanced kind of communication skills and all of that, primarily due to experience. Our talent development pathway can look something like this. So our top left can be kids when they are girls, when they enter the sport, and all the way down, taking them up through the development. So whether that's progressing with the club, maybe it's to college, and maybe then it is to professional or international levels. So all of these represents our talent development pathway. And there is a process of talent ID and selection that happens at every one of those. If we're not aware of differences in maturation, so perhaps we have our pathways stacked with early maturers. If we're not familiar with the relative age effect, and we actually have kids represented that actually are all or predominantly from those first 3 months after the cutoff date, well, then it undermines our talent development pathway a little bit. It shows that our current athlete development model is biased, and whether that's biased from a relative age perspective or a focus or an emphasis on our early maturing girls. I'm going to finish up with 2 slides or into some coaching considerations. So if we take the goal to help adolescents to have a lifelong love of sport and exercise, lay the foundations for lifelong health, and also set the scene for optimal performance and development, I think if we set that as our target or our goal, I think we're coming from a good place in terms of how to support the athletes through King's Hammer. First one of those is about energy demands. So reflect back on the growth curves that I showed you earlier. So puberty is a huge energy cost to the body. Add in those huge growth rates, add on the normal function of the body, add school, add social life, and now add training and competition. The energy demands for being a teenager is really high. And when we say they'll eat us out of house and home, that's a real thing, and that's okay. But low energy availability means that energy levels are not being met, and that will impact on health and performance, and also increase the risk of injury, and can actually lead to a syndrome called a relative energy deficiency in sport. Low energy availability can lead to changes in the menstrual cycle. So opportunities for energy intake should be maximised, and that's something that you as a coach and a club can consider how we could go about doing that. Definitely on match and heavy training days to prevent this pattern of low energy availability. Like, encourage parents and kids to fuel their bodies appropriately, consider food at training, support healthy eating practices, give positive messaging and role modeling around food, especially when we consider this in relation to how the natural widening of the hips and accumulation of fat mass can impact confidence. Like, it can be quite a tricky thing to navigate. But player education on the negative consequences of this low energy availability can be considered. How might you do that? I've seen it work well with a questionnaire or a screening tool. that you can use to gather information on areas such as menstruation, nutrition, sleep, injury, those kinds of things. I mentioned about reducing the taboo of it. So it might even be, you bring it up at an initial meeting to say, look, this is something that we're going to be giving out. It's really healthy to discuss menstruation. And I think if you approach it proactively, I think it will help with that. What I think was interesting with that is when we talk about body composition assessment, there was a study that spoke to professional female soccer players, and they reflected on personal accounts of their teenage years of feeling over-assessed, and that altered their eating habits, and then led to them kind of avoiding like carbohydrates after intense training and that kind of thing. And like really we have cultural problems around body composition and body image. So definitely there's healthy practices around body composition, because really there isn't a one homogenous picture of a top level soccer player. There was a really interesting study done of over 500 players from 24 countries that participated in the FIFA World Cup in 2019. And the stature ranged from 1.48 to 1.87 meters. Body mass ranged from 46 to 88 kg. So, really we should think that adopting kind of specific anthropometric and body composition targets might just be unjustified as well. So yeah, a positive culture around body composition is really, really important. Managing load is something to consider there as well. I have a couple of things in there, and I'm happy to maybe go through some of them later if they come through in questions. But yeah, I mean, the thing about early specialization is that it can lead to increased rates of burnout and overuse injuries. So we might look at that. We might look at, well, what are they doing in the off season? Like encourage a change of movement patterns specifically. So find sports or activities that are fundamentally different than soccer. Free play is really important. There was a Australasian College of Sport and Exercise Physicians who come out with this 2-to-1 ratio. So for every hour of organized sport, kids should do 30 minutes of adult free play in the sport as well. I would even suggest that it should be higher than that importance of child-led play. Why a lot of stuff, it can impact like confidence, competence as well, and it just gets them used to maybe leadership or exploring different movement patterns as well. So lots of things we can do here in terms of managing load. The third one that I have on that sheet there is awareness of the relative age effect and biological maturation. So I've gone over both of those earlier in the presentation. So do a review of RAE, relative age effect patterns in the club. How does it look? Is there a point like that Norwegian graph where it actually gets kind of earlier and earlier? Is there a difference between maybe the rec or the grassroots teams and travel premier or academy teams? And then reflect as a group why that might be. Like, are we looking at this short-term performance versus maybe our long-term development? Use biological data to help challenge players. It's relatively easy to do. There's spreadsheets for this online. It's quite easy. I know US Soccer did roll out a bit of kind of biobanding. So all about challenge and just having extra things in the tool belt. If we're comparing players for the purpose of selection, can we compare players on their biological age and stage rather than maybe their chronological age? Because we've seen from those early graphs how varied they can be. Final two things, maintaining engagement. How might you do that? So I always say, we talk about periodizing things like strength training, but we should also do that with challenge. So challenge our kids, but supported by you, like retain that element of competence. Can they achieve the task? Are they still feeling challenged? But are they still enjoying it as well? Taking that strengths-based approach to development, particularly during these awkward phases of growth and awkward adolescence, yeah, they probably know that their technical skills aren't as good as they might have been, but they will come back and they'll get better. Create fresh opportunities for girls to maybe discover new sporting experiences. So I said earlier that something that they'll do is, feel like they have to find something new that reflects them as growing into a woman. Well, can that happen through the club, or what type of experiences can be facilitated in the environment? Support athletes then, empower them to take control of their own health and well-being. So some kind of education platform, I think, is really important. And that will help support their confidence and self-esteem and really help them establish their new adult identity. So that empowerment, you're helping them to be autonomous and make decisions. And we know autonomy is really important for developing sustained motivation. I've mentioned already that we can just normalize puberty and periods and alleviate fears of being the only one that's going through this process of change. Like, keep promoting the emotional and social benefits of sports. We said about that, how important peers are with this age group. And it helps them to overcome anxiety and just it kind of helps them cope better. And education for them is really important there as well. I think awareness of your presence as a significant role model is key, and maybe reflect or consider how you talk about body and body image. Other ways to support athletes, we can measure height regularly to establish that peak height velocity, and then maybe consider individualities in training as well. I've said about trying to avoid selection until as late as possible, and I know coaches are sometimes hamstrung by structures and administrators, but as long as we can, keeping as many people in the pathway, because we've heard the analogy of puberty can be like a black hole. We don't know what the kids are going to be like when we come out the far side, so we just have to support them and retain them really as best we can. Like, how can we challenge these early matures or our shouting talents, but also support and provide opportunities for our late matures? Okay, final takeaway. I hope that you've been able to understand the accent the whole way through. Puberty is an important time for growth, and this whole kind of adolescent period, really important time for development, physical, psychological, social, emotional, and really young female athletes should be assisted through these changes to develop healthy lifetime love and engagement with sport. I think if we can do that first and foremost, health, lifelong engagement, then performing to their maximum will come from that. So give consideration to how you as a coach and the broader structures as a club are designed to, are there effective or fluid pathways that support and challenge these developing athletes who will have different needs depending on their time. I will stop sharing my screen.
Laura, thank you so much. Wow. It is amazing the amount of information that was presented, and hopefully, our coaches. I don't think your accent impacted it at all. I think you were tremendous. So, I don't know. I did have, before we jump into questions, just some of my own thoughts, because you mentioned trying to break the taboo of the development cycle, and particularly the menstruation cycle and that dropout period. So I wonder what your input would be on how do our coaches, because of it being taboo, and especially some of our male coaches who are coaching females, is there a best way to approach this, and what age? Because I'm watching your graphics and it looks like, again, I coach high school and coached college players previously, and so I was always aware of that. But it seems like we really should be focusing on this at a much earlier age. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are definitely like age and stage appropriate ways that we can approach this. I think we don't just turn up to training one day and announce that we're going to start talking about the menstrual cycle. I think there are, we talk to parents and say this is something that we hope to get a little bit more information on to support the athletes. I think if we use that framing that it is to support their healthy development, we might bring it up at the start of season or kind of pre-season meetings, maybe introduce them to some of the research. I would definitely try and encourage them to download that app for their own education purposes around periods. And I think if we can do that, then suddenly now the club is a space where that girls don't feel like they have to be embarrassed about any of that. So, the percentages were 50% of girls tended to avoid sport around that time. Well, actually, if that taboo is broken a little bit, I think we can have more sustained and healthy engagement in the sport.
Great. Before I jump in, we actually have a couple of questions, but I just want to remind everyone that if you haven't already posted a question, now's the time. Please feel free to post it again in the chat. Whether you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, you can go ahead and throw in a chat and it'll pop up for us so we can make sure that we get it for Dr. Finnegan. So kind of to follow up on that, we have a question about that Fitter app. Is there an age band? When do we want to try and engage female athletes in utilizing that?
I think if we talk to parents, and I think that's the really good thing about these dual presentations, is that next week we'll be able to talk to parents and give them some of this information. But yeah, if we are talking about the age of 12 and a half being that onset of menstruation, then maybe around that. But we will talk before that about just things like body changing, and we will be we talk to the girls and we'll introduce them to concepts like maybe that adolescent awkwardness that they might experience. And again, it's about normalizing that as well, that suddenly they aren't feeling, well, gosh, I just can't play the sport like I used to be able to. So I feel more competent in the area of education or a different sport. So actually I'm going to leave soccer and I'm going to go over there because that place makes me feel good about myself. So if we can just keep this healthy relationship with girls and educate them, and as I said, we know autonomy is really important. So educate them to educate themselves really.
Well, that's awesome. So, and a coach asked, and so you said you mentioned specialization. Do you have specific thoughts on time frame for specialization?
Yeah, I mean, technically, a child specializing early, there are 3 questions that they'll suggest that you ask to try and identify if a kid is specializing early, and that is about does the athlete train or play for more than 8 months per year in a given sport? Do they have a single main sport, and have they stopped playing everything else under 18? And that would be a kid that has specialized. I think there are, I do. I think we should encourage movements. Some of my own research project actually looked at the positive psychological benefits that youth soccer players got from engaging in different sports. So maybe they were feeling that their soccer actually wasn't going too well for them, but actually being able to come out, engage in other sports and come back in was beneficial for them. But look, it's tricky because you do have discussions about, well, how much is too much then? And that, I think that the total sport participation, like training and competition, really should be limited to no more than maybe 16 hours a week. The guideline from medical professionals is that the time spent in organised sport per week should not exceed the adult's age. So maybe a 10-year-old shouldn't be doing any more than maybe 10 hours in organised sport up to that kind of 16-hour. So that's really hard, but I would encourage that free play that I spoke about. So we know that some of the issues that with specialization in sport, that increased training, the body can succumb to overtraining, greater risk of acute and chronic injuries as well.
That's
I think
great.
that probably the worst thing that's ever happened this field is 10,000 hours, because that made us feel like we have to kind of cram this specific number of hours into a developmental pathway. But no, if we take the approach that, for example, the Manchester United Academy takes, that's 10,000 experiences. So they'll try and expose the kids to different things, and maybe it's different sports, maybe it's biobanding 1 week where you're challenged more effectively against kids the same growth as you. So I would think of development in that rounded way.
Great. Well, I appreciate that's a great response. And again, as for most of us, gives us a lot that we need to be considering when we're trying to explore developing these kids and develop talent, but just develop the personalities. So I think that's going to be the conclusion of our presentation here. Laura, any last thoughts? And again, I will mention if there are other questions that come in that we weren't able to get to, I will pass those along to Dr. Finnegan, and we'll get those answered for you and have those available as a part of the presentation posting on our website. And again, you can revisit this, watch it over again on our Facebook channel or on our YouTube channel. They'll be available right away. Laura, any last thoughts or conclusions or conversations that you want to leave with our coaches for today?
Yeah, I think if we take that lens on everything we're doing, that look, we can lay the foundations to create healthy and happy females that will sustain engagement in hopefully our sport, but any sport really. But we hope to keep them and make them feel valued within our club, and keep them coming back, really, to sustain that lifelong participation, because that will lead to them achieving their full potential as well.
Excellent. Well, again, I just want to thank you so much for taking time and sharing with our coaches this afternoon. We're really looking forward to seeing you again next week for the presentation with our families. And to our coaches, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We hope you found a lot of value. I know I did in the presentation, and we look forward to seeing everybody out on the fields. So thanks again, Laura. Have a great night.
Thank you. You too.